Hello, today is Tuesday, March 30th, 2021. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. This is part 2 of a 2-part podcast series where Mark Sheard, TC2's UK Managing Director, and I take a look at SD-WAN, the benefits it can provide your company, and some of the pitfalls you better be watching for if you go down the SD-WAN path. Hey, Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Joe. Good to be back. Today is brass tacks time, and hopefully we are going to provide some insights that enterprises can take advantage of in pushing forward with SD-WAN.
Yeah, I mean, SD-WAN, it has been a game changer for enterprises that do their homework and really understand how to get the most out of the solution. Of course, it's not just a plug-and-play solution.
No, it isn't. And one of the things we're going to do today is try and address some of those challenges and seize the challenges we come across that enterprises are having to face to at least get through and work out what their strategy for SD-WAN implementation is. Quite often, one of the things we do see is they slip into a default course of action. For example, slipping into going with a single source. And this can be particularly prevalent where you have a big, strong relationship with Cisco or a tier 1 carrier, which is very much, as we all know, relationship led and can be to the exclusion of other potential providers. What that does mean in the end is that as a consequence, you can be left with entrenched offer positions because you've had this very early dialogue, which then becomes the baseline for further discussion. And what that can do is mean that you've got fairly expensive add-ins or elements that you've missed are difficult to address later on in the process. And so you can end up with much higher costs than you could have done if you'd initiated this all with a good leverage in the first instance. Far better is actually to look at this, stand back and have a strategy. So test your strategy to make sure that you have the right approach from the beginning. And this is worth doing, actually, even if you're already on the SD-WAN journey. And we have several clients who work with us to reset their strategy and just make sure they're doing the right things. The worst case from that is you confirm you're doing the right thing. The best case is you avoid some pretty horrendous delays and costs downstream. And with a transformational technology such as SD-WAN, there really is no rational excuse for not having competition.
Okay, so you have potential partners in mind, noting your earlier points that there may be more than one possible solution. So what's next?
It's a great question. This always has to be a custom-based assessment on where you are starting from, your particular constraints that apply to you. And this brings us back actually to working back on and looking at your strategy. That said, there is a simple principle to follow. To inform your decisions, do the component and the comparative total cost modeling that allows you to properly see the impact of, for example, so-called simplicity of a SASE model versus best-of-breed type solutions. And to understand also the price tag that goes with the different capabilities, whether you want those capabilities and how they stack up in terms of the commercial differences between the proposals.
You know, the clients that I work with that have deployed SD-WAN, they love it. But, if you're not careful and thoughtful, there are pitfalls. So, Mark, what are some of the pitfalls that you've seen?
Well, I'll list a few off, and one of them is a bit of a contradiction is the fact, A, is focusing too much on cost, or B, focusing not enough on cost. You can delete as applicable there. Let me explain. What we regularly see is networking-led teams that have engaged in detailed solution dialogue, even trials with a supplier, without really having a good idea and understanding of anything other than a cursory understanding, that is, of the cost base. On more than one occasion, this has led to some extremely nasty surprises downstream, if nothing else, for the budgeting process or for the executive sign-off process. And in the worst case, it's brought the project to a complete halt and resulted actually in the launching of a completely new RFP to apply some leverage and get better costs. Conversely, and almost as bad, is putting cost ahead of capability in the SD-WAN selection. We work hard to reduce cost, but you shouldn't do it at the whole expense of the solution. Because in reality, the total cost of the SD-WAN solution should be a relatively small component compared to the transport savings that you might gain. There are notable exceptions, particularly, for example, if the enterprise is being caught out with some excessive management charges, and that can quite often happen with SD-WAN. But the chosen SD-WAN solution, we've got to remember, really does underpin your networking service for the future. And you want the best you can get at the market-leading price, covering all the commercial gaps and all the risks. So apply rigor to the process. However, if the right solution costs a few more dollars, then so be it. Now, another failing is not looking wide enough at alternative solutions. You mentioned that. You should have a clear justification for your preferences. I'm not going to dwell on all the different options that are available today, one-stop, best of breed, managed service or DIY, etc., etc. But going with, for example, the CIO said so, can be hard to resist. But faced with clear, objective assessments, most CIOs can behave remarkably rationally. And beyond this, I've got to say, I think what the worst mistake we see is automatically assuming your incumbent provider is the best choice or defaulting into that choice without looking more widely. That's really dangerous.
Hey, so tell me more about that requirements process that you mentioned.
Well, one of the things, as you know, I'm a big exponent of pushing forward the requirements process. It's mainly about doing a holistic review of your requirements around SD-WAN. It's not just technical, because it must encompass such things as support, operations, security, commercial billing, key contractual terms. You need to look very widely. If you don't do this, what you do end up doing is really failing to set up the ask on your supplier, whether you're sourcing actually single source, with a single supplier, or via competition. You may pay for it later if you don't go through a coherent and rigorous requirements process.
Yeah, one of the key requirement discussions that I always have with clients is the best solution, a managed service versus a DIY solution.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Managed service versus DIY comes up a lot in conversation. SD-WAN allows you to do more yourself, but it may not be quite as easy as advertised. In fact, it isn't quite as easy as advertised. If you run your network today, SD-WAN isn't going to be more difficult, and you'll be able to deal with it. If not, you may need to take more of a staged approach if you have an aspiration to take on more of the management yourself. And that's more common now than it was in sourcing management. And this is where one of the key terms I see is co-managed. And this is often about where enterprises want a greater role and visibility. And this can also be a stepping stone to taking management fully in-house. That said, interestingly, the trend we see in a lot of the sourcing for large enterprise is actually more to managed service, and where DIY was the route a lot of people were trying to go, that's sort of swinging back. Some of that, I guess, is increasing capability, and with that complexity of SD-WAN, and probably recognition of the wider complexities that perhaps go with the SASE concept, which I talked about in the last podcast. Some of it also, I have to say, is to do with implementation, and certainly the first implementation of SD-WAN, which presents challenges. One of the things we see here, going back to your pitfalls point, is too often we see organizations not actually paying enough attention to the rigors of implementation. If you don't, you may find yourself paying additional charges for field resources or expert SD-WAN vendor specific expertise, or for shipping or installation, or for managing the project that you hadn't thought of. You've got to make sure that your plans line up with the contractual obligations and apply good program management practices to your implementation. It isn't the zero touch drop of a hat nirvana that sometimes is mentioned.
Hey, so what about transport? You mentioned that this is pivotal to the cost case earlier. So what are some of the do's and don'ts in that space?
I'll be brief. I mean, it is key. Get your transport approach, the underlying transport that you're going to use, very much aligned with your SD-WAN. It's really also important that you align it in terms of implementation, because there's a lag on delivery of transport. And so cut over and all of those things need to be harmonized. It's important just to model the different options on that transport. I'm not going to dwell on the options. We've spoken about those in various other podcasts, but one example I can give you to just illustrate that point is where such modeling, which we undertook, really did expose why a real drive for going with cellular broadband transport across all the sites from one enterprise. We actually managed to demonstrate that for a large part of the inventory of those sites, it would actually be cheaper, more cost effective to go with higher performance dedicated internet access technologies than it would with cellular, because of the specific plans associated with cellular. So always do the modeling. The numbers, once you do them properly, don't lie.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Why don't you wrap up by giving some takeaways to complement what we've covered today, things that might help them avoid some pain?
Yeah, I guess I'd leave you with what I would see as some of the best practice points. It's not exhaustive, but we've seen things go wrong in recent SD-WAN procurements, and where we've been invited actually in a later stage in a recovery mode. So things that I would say are the wise enterprises, they work up a strategy assessment. I know I'm banging a drum, but that's the basis of their actions and their plans and their decisions. And it really does pay off. It's like writing a draft essay plan first. The final scope, at least most of it, should be set in the RFP or the requirements assessment phase. If you wait to the detailed statement of work production with your chosen provider, I can pretty much assure you it will uncover gaps that will probably or almost certainly attract costs that you will have to pay for, extra costs. In many cases, costs you could have eradicated. And that really leads into the third point I make, is that time for negotiation is before the handshake on selection of preferred supplier. Leverage matters. It's traditional good practice. Fourth, if you're sourcing from your network provider, one thing to keep an eye out for is that the legal T's and C's may be different from your current MSA, and you need to look at that. This applies particularly for the likes of also for Cisco and the tier 1 carriers. Just be cautious and if possible, involve your legal counsel early. Another thing to draw out is there can be greater flexibility in some of the other managed service vendors. But again, only if you're clear what you want up front. Doing the negotiation downstream is tougher. I guess I'd leave you with the final point is understand your specific SD-WAN vendor's conditions. So I mean conditions with their solution, be it bandwidth dependency, solution add-ons, hardware limitations, in terms of throughput, up, down, capacity, how that works, or functionality, uplifts, costs. The suppliers, they vary. You can't assume that all licenses and hardware are equal. And another one, don't forget maintenance. I mean, it depends on your support model, but don't forget that that's wrapped in and what cost that may attract. And finally, what I'd say, even with the same underlying SD-WAN technology, so you could take Versa, for example, supplied by two different managed service providers, don't assume that there won't be big differences in the offers from the various managed service vendors. The devil is in the detail, and I have to say the pricing and the conditions can vary widely between two managed service providers offering essentially the same solution.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Now, as you've just heard, SD-WAN is certainly a technology that better be on your networking radar. If you'd like to learn more about SD-WAN and how to begin your assessment, you can contact Mark, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues by giving us a call or dropping us an email. We would love to help. Now, you can also stay up to date by subscribing to Staying Connected, checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.